is here, so I have the time. So where are you?
So has someone asked for a taxi for you after the...
Laura said she will
Namore.
take care of it.
Because it takes a while until the taxi arrives.
Okay. So I don't know.
Because we are not in the center of the...
Yeah, maybe they should know.
Because the thing is that we have to stay for another hour for the association. But of course you don't have to.
Yeah, no, I would be happy to go down to the...
Yeah, you have a little bit of time either to rest or... Yeah. So you want that to meet? And we are going to go around and go to the
Yeah.
Poca gente aquí. Ha ido la hora, pero creo que no tiene mucho éxito. Okay, we'll wait a little bit.
Yeah.
The thing is that there was no coffee break in between the regular sessions and this one, so people didn't have enough time to talk about the past session and that session. So it's taking longer than...
That is fine.
Strange in German than
Exactly, no, everyone is making
here
fun.
before, right?
But actually, all my... but then you have this Germans who just drink,
Yeah.
party. But I think they also actually Germans love to go here and there. Lots of nice mountains.
Yeah. One thing is the drunk people that come here just to drink.
Yeah. Of which I'm sure there are also enough, but...
The family. Of course, they take advantage that the alcohol is cheaper in Spain. I'm sure that I hope they don't get it.
No, I don't think...
Enjoy the
Obviously,
wine
the
and
price
the...
difference is not that much. I think it used to be 30 years ago. Yeah, but it's just...
So good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to this plenary session this afternoon. Our speaker today is Nicola Fuchs. She's the president of the WCB Berlin Social Science Center and professor of macroeconomics and development at Goethe University Frankfurt. She received her PhD in economics from Yale University. She was assistant professor at Harvard University, and she holds an honorary doctorate from Otto von Guericke University Magdeburg. Nicola is program director of the Macroeconomics and Growth Program at the CEPR, an elected fellow at the Econometric Society. She received the 2018 Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize of the German Science Foundation, the highest scientific award in Germany, and the 2016 Grossen Prize of the German Economic Association. In 2018, she was also awarded an ERC Consolidated Grant. She's a member of the German National Academy of Science and of the Scientific Advisory Boards of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action and the German Central Bank. She holds many affiliations in international research networks. Nicola's research focuses on the analysis of household saving and labor supply behavior and the heterogeneity of preferences. Today, she's going to talk about forward-looking labor supply responses to pension wealth changes. Thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. So the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Muchas gracias por la introducción con todas las palabras difíciles en alemán. Y muchas gracias por invitarme a presentar acá. And now I switch to English. So I'm going to talk about forward-looking labor supply responses to pension wealth changes, and I will present you some evidence from Germany on this. And this is joint work with Elisabeth Artmann at the IAB and Giulia Giupponi from Bocconi University. So we already talked about demographic trends in Ricardo's keynote lecture at lunchtime and how they put a strain on the fiscal sustainability of pay-as-you-go social security systems in Europe, and we were also investigating what effects do pension reforms then have on savings behavior of households. And a lot of countries have implemented different pension reforms to encourage later retirement in order to address this issue of fiscal sustainability. And the typical reforms, they could be either a tightening of the contribution benefit link, a reduction of the benefit generosity, or an increase of the statutory retirement age. And there is a relatively rich literature that investigates how these changes and these pension reforms actually affect retirement behavior. So do people postpone retirement in reply to these reforms? And then there is also some literature and some thoughts then looking at what effects do these pension reforms have on savings behavior of households, and that's what we discussed at the lunchtime lecture. But then if individuals are really forward-looking, any pension reform should not only affect their savings behavior and the actual retirement behavior, but it should also affect their labor supply behavior before they come close to the retirement age. So the potential aggregate labor supply implications of pension reforms could be much larger than the ones that are implied just by the actual postponement of entering retirement. And that's what we are after in this paper. So the question that we ask is, what are the effect of changes in pension wealth, so in the generosity of the pension system, on labor supply behavior before retirement? So are individuals forward-looking, and when they think about their labor supply decisions today, do they take also the pension wealth into account? This is the main question, And then I will show you some evidence on that, and we will also analyze whether these effects are heterogeneous by different individual characteristics. And third, are there intra-household spillover of these changes in pension wealth? So if the pension wealth of one spouse, for example, is increased, does not only this spouse change her labor supply behavior, but also the other spouse. So if you had a unitary household model, then we would expect these spillover effects across households. So there is not that much of a literature, and I will come to that, that answers these questions. And that is because it's challenging due to different reasons. So first, in a typical pension reform, you have both a wealth effect and a substitution effect, and they could go in opposite directions. And that's why you might not see any reply of labor supply. Secondly, usually these reforms are gradually phased in, so it's very hard to econometrically identify any effect. Then third, individuals far from retirement age are typically identically treated, so you don't have a control on a treatment group readily available. And last, many reforms are relatively complicated, and then if you don't see any response by individuals, you always wonder, is it because they don't respond to the incentives or because they just didn't understand what this reform is about? So they had a hard time really thinking about the implications of the reform on their pension wealth. So we found a setting that allows us to address these challenges, and this is what we do in a nutshell in this paper. So we exploit a German pension reform that changed the generosity of childcare pension contributions for mothers of children born before January 1st, 1992. So I will give you the details of the pension system and of this reform. But really what it did is it exogenously increased the pension wealth of mothers who gave birth before 1992. And this increase in the pension wealth was quite sizable. So the mothers of these children, they experienced a permanent increase in their pension wealth of 4.4% in the present discounted value. So their pension wealth went up by almost 5%. We use administrative social security data, and then we do a simple diff in diff design and compare the labor supply choices of women whose first child was born just before or just after this cutoff of January 1st, 1992, before and after the reform. So it's a fairly straightforward econometric setup. And by doing that, we provide novel estimates of the effects of pension wealth on individual labor supply over the following 5 years. So we analyze the labor supply of these women 5 years following the reform. And at the time of the reform, the women are on average aged 50, and I'm always very happy if my two younger co-authors say they are far from retirement age and they are relatively young, so I want to stress it here. I wouldn't say they are relatively young, but it's not an age where you typically think about entering retirement quite yet. And what do we find? We actually do find significant labor supply responses that imply a marginal propensity to earn of minus 0.54. So what that means is that for every euro that you give these women in terms of pension wealth, they reduce their labor earnings by 54 cents. So it's quite a sizable effect, I would say. And secondly, we find this response on the intensive margin, not on the extensive margin, which is a typical finding when you look at actually individuals close to retirement age who respond by entering retirement. So here is the related literature. I won't go over it in detail, but I already told you there's a relatively extensive literature on labor supply responses to pension changes close to retirement, and there are relatively few papers that look at more forward-looking responses. And then there are also relatively few papers that really identify wealth effects on labor supply. So yeah, talking to PhD students here, I think we know quite a bit already about the marginal propensity to consume, but we know much less about the marginal propensity to earn. So if you give an extra dollar or an extra euro to an individual, what is the labor supply response of this individual? And what we know of that comes from papers that exploit retirement payments or other transfers. So the paper by Jones and Marinescu, for example, looks at the Alaska Permanent Fund. And then we have a few studies that actually study the labor supply responses of lottery winners. So what I will do is I will go over the institutional context and data and empirical strategy, and then present you the results and talk a bit more about the effects, both in their heterogeneity and whether we also see responses by the spouse. And I will leave some time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions in between, let me know, and I'm happy to explain further. So let's start with the institutional context. So this is a one slide on the German pension system, which in its details is fairly complicated, but in the main setup it's actually fairly straightforward. So the German public pension system is a pay-as-you-go system, as most European countries have it. And the pension payments are determined by a really simple formula that has two main components. The first is the cumulated pension contributions that are measured in pension points. So while the individual works, the individual pays pension contributions, those get translated in pension points, and then at the time of retirement, one can calculate the cumulated pension points. And then the cumulated pension points get a monetary value assigned to each of these points, so this monetary value is determined every year by the government. It's absolutely homogeneous, the same for everyone. And then you just multiply the cumulated pension points with the monetary value for each point, and that gives you the monthly pensions. So only if individuals go into early retirement or disability retirement or so, then there are some adjustment factors. But other than that, it's fairly straightforward. And what is also fairly nice is that a pension point has a fairly natural interpretation, because an individual earns exactly one pension point in a year if the individual earns the average income in this year, right? So every year, one pension point contributes exactly to the average annual income. So if you earn 20% more than the average person, you would accumulate 1.2 pension points. If you earn 50% less, you get half a pension point, right? And then that is just accumulated over the working life. So this is the main way to earn pension points by working and contributing to the social security system. But then there are some other routes, and another very important one for women are childcare pension benefits. So here I give you the timeline of these childcare pension benefits, but what is really important is only the last two periods, so 1999 and 2014. So in 1986, the German government introduced that mothers get pension contributions for childcare periods. And the German word for that is mother pension, Mütterrente. Though in principle, this is not assigned to mothers. In principle, it's assigned to one of the parents. In practice, it's automatically assigned to the mother. And if you want the pension points to be attributed by the father, you have to put in a written request. And in 98% of the cases, the pension points stay with the mother. So de facto, it's the mother's pension. So when it was introduced in 1986, it was introduced such that a mother could get a maximum of 0.75, so 3/4 of a pension point per child for 1 year after birth. But if she was working in this first year after birth and was earning pension points through working, those were then the pension points for childbirth were fully withdrawn from that. So if she worked, for example, the mother, and she earned half a pension point through working, then she would only get 1/4 of a pension point for the child. If she earned 1 pension point by working, she wouldn't get any child pension points. Then in 1992, the government made this pension scheme more generous, and the duration was extended to 3 years, but only for children born on or after January 1st, 1992. So now here this discontinuity arises between children born before or after January 1992. And I guess the logic of 3 years was that at a time you also got job security for 3 years, so childcare typically only started at the age of 3 years for children, so the norm for mothers was to stay home for 3 years at least before they went back to giving birth. Then in 1999, the system was made even more generous and also easier to deal with us econometrically. So the generosity of the benefit was extended to from 0.75 to 1 pension point per year. And the earnings test was repeated retroactively. So that means from 1999 onwards, every mother got 3 pension points for a child born 1992 or later, and 1 pension point for a child born before 1992, right? And all this was done also retroactively. And now it didn't matter whether she worked or not anymore, also retroactively. So it's really, you get pension points just for giving birth. That's what it is. And then the reform that we are really analyzing is the reform in July 2014. And at that point in time, the government gave 1 extra pension point per child for children born before 1992. So here you see the timeline of the Mütterrente reform, and here's the reform that we really analyze. So before 2014, mothers of children born before 1992 had 1 pension point, mothers of children born later had 3 pension points, and then in 2014, nothing changed for the mothers who gave birth after 1992, but the mothers giving birth before 1992, they got 1 extra pension points. So it's an exogenous increase in their pension wealth, and now we're analyzing, do they respond to that by adjusting their labor supply? So how large was this effect? I already gave this number in the introduction. For the mothers in our sample, on average, their pension wealth went up by 3,830 euros, and that is a 4.4% increase in the present discounted value of their pension wealth. What is very nice about the reform, it's really a pure wealth effect. There's no substitution effect, right? So any labor supply decisions had no effect on this pension change. And also, obviously, there was no chance to manipulate this reform because these mothers had given birth 22 years before, so nothing you could do there. And also importantly, nothing else really changed in the system, so it was a reform that was relatively well understood and also well announced, as I will show. So if leisure is a normal good, we would think that due to this increase, this exogenous increase in the pension wealth, the affected mothers will cut back their labor supply. And they could do that along different margins. They could reduce their hours. They could drop out of the labor market. They could also enter earlier into retirement. So how did this, just a couple more slides, I think, on the reform. Was this reform well announced, well understood? Why came it about? So this Mütterrente was really an item of the Christian Democratic Union in the campaign for the 2013 election, and the rhetoric was really about it's not fair that mothers of older children get less pension than mothers of younger children, so we should change that. And why did they increase only by 1 pension point? Because this reform is very, very expensive. I think otherwise they would have really gone to 3 pension points as well. So in September, the Christian Democrats won the election. They got into a coalition with the Social Democratic Party. And this pension reform was really a central part of this coalition agreement that they signed. It's already on the first page, and already there in December 2013, it stated that this reform will be implemented in July 1st of the following year, what also happened. So we take December 2013 as the point in time in which households understood that this reform is taking place. And since it was a central electoral item, it was highly debated during the electoral campaign. It also received ample news coverage. And on top of that, the German pension insurance sends an annualized letter to every household that says, what will be your expected pension? What are your contributions so far? And every mother who was affected by this reform also got an individualized letter at the time of the reform that told her exactly how much more pension she would get. So I can show you here, this is such a letter. I mean, you can't read it, but this is a woman who has 3 children and would state exactly, these are your 3 children. This is their birth date before 1992, and now you get more pensions for having given birth to these 3 children. So it was fairly well understood. I also remember how my mother was very happy that she got now 2 more pension points after the reform. Yes. Okay, so this is what we are analyzing. What is the data? Some of you might know the data. It's the integrated employment biography. It's an administrative data set that has the individual working histories of all Germans who are subject to social security contributions. So we have the universe of the German population, except for civil servants and self-employed who are not subject to social security. So the data set is very nice because it has daily earnings and spell data on employment and unemployment insurance receipt. So you can really very well analyze earnings responses. What it doesn't have, as much of the Social Security data worldwide, is data on hours. Right? So what we will find in the end is data results on earnings. We hypothesize that these are driven by changes in hours, but we also do have some indication because we have a part-time and a full-time indicator, or an indicator whether an individual is on marginal employment. So the data set, unfortunately, also has some disadvantages for our study. The most important one is that childbirth are not directly recorded in the data set because they don't matter for Social Security, they just matter for the pensions, or they don't matter for unemployment insurance, they just matter for the pensions. But you can impute childbirth based on deregistrations and due to statutory health insurance. This is a method that has been employed also by Uta Schönberg and others, and that is also tested to work relatively well for the first birth of a mother. So essentially, you assign a mother as having given birth if a woman below the age of 39 drops out due to health reasons for more than 14 weeks out of the labor force, because 14 weeks is a mandatory maternity leave period in Germany. So obviously there are some false birth in there because some women just get sick and don't work for a long time and they would be assigned a birth, but it has been shown that this measurement error is relatively low. But it only works well for the first child because only for the first birth you observe the mothers before they give birth. So mothers who don't work again between different births, they will never show up in between in the data set anymore. So we only look at first birth and compare mothers who gave birth to their first child just before or after the cutoff date. And so pension points can also have to be imputed here based on the employment histories, but we only need that for a heterogeneity effect. And then we are interested in the in potential spillovers. So what is the labor supply response also of the spouses of these mothers? And here we make use of the statistical matching procedure that matches individuals to their spouses based on sharing the same surname and having the same address. So the spouses are not systematically linked in the data set, so you have to link them ex post, and you will lose some spouses by doing that, but you have still a fair number of couples that you can analyze. And then apart from that, we also use data from the insurance account sample from the German pension registries. So that would actually be the better data set to use because it has childbirth, it has pension points in there, but you can only access 2% of these data set. So even if you work within the agency, you don't have access to the full data set. They just haven't made it available yet for scientific purposes, and we are lobbying to change that, and that's why we only use it to calculate this number of 3,830 euros in pension wealth changes and relate it to this, or say this is the 4.4% increase of the typical women in our sample. So here you see the descriptive statistics, and on this first column, there are mothers who gave birth in the 3 months before January 1st, 1992. This is our treatment group. And then here are the mothers who give birth just after January 1992 and the 3 months afterwards. These are our control group, right? So we look at a very narrow window of women who gave birth in a 6-month period around January 1st, 1992. And since we have the full universe of the data, we can do that, and we still have roughly 100,000 women who gave birth in this 6 months. So the women are on average 27 years old when they give birth, so on average at the time of the reform they are almost 50 years old, and at the time of the reform 72% work, but most of them work part-time, right? So 38% work part-time, 13% work in marginal employment, and only 21% work full-time. And we later on look at half-yearly earnings, and so the unconditional earnings in the half year before the reform is 7,700 euros, so it's not that high because most of these women work part-time So conditional earnings are a bit more than 10,000 euros for half a year, so 20,000 euros as in yearly earnings. So what is our empirical strategy? We run a simple diff in diff and compare the evolution of individual labor supply, here indicated as Y, of mothers in the treatment group who gave birth to their first child just before January 1992, so those are the ones that have this treatment dummy equal to 1, to those who give birth just afterward with a treatment dummy of 0, before and after December 2013. So we regress the individual labor market outcome on time dummies, where we look at half-yearly earnings, as I said, on individual dummies, and then on this treatment dummy interacted with different time dummies, so I can show you the full evolution of pre and post effects. We do a donut diff in diff because I told you we impute childbirth, and we impute it such that the woman gives birth 6 weeks after she goes on sick leave, because 6 weeks is a mandatory maternity leave before you give birth, but obviously very few children actually appear on the due date, and some women might go on sick leave a little bit earlier. So the actual birth date has some measurement error, and then we do a donut diff and diff and excludes birth in a 2 weeks bandwidth around the cutoff, and we do a lot of sensitivity with this, and it really doesn't matter much. So this gives you the reduced form effect of the reform on labor supply, and then to calculate the elasticity or the marginal propensity to earn, we simulate this pension wealth effect in the retirement insurance data, as I already told you, and then we can rescale this reduced form effect by the simulated pension wealth effect. So these are the main results of the reform. This is really the main graph as a result. So here you see total earnings, unconditional unemployment, so any women not working, it shows up with 0 earnings here in the 5 years prior to the reform, and then in the 5 years following to the reform, and this is a diff and diff estimate, so comparing the earnings of the treated women with those of the untreated women. And as you can see, there are no pre-trends, but then after the reform, this gap opens up, and the earnings, the unconditional earnings of the mothers who got this positive change in pension wealth, they fall behind those of the mothers in the control group. And in terms of size, what you see is that in the first 2.5 years or so, the unconditional half-yearly earnings fall by 50 euros. In the next 2.5 years, they fall by roughly 100 euros. So these are half-yearly earnings, so it would be in annual earnings would be 100 euros in the short run and 200 euros in the medium run. And if you put that relative to their earnings, that implies a total earnings decrease of 0.7% in the short run and 1.3% in the medium run. Right. So it's not huge, but it is a significant earnings effect. So here now I show you a regression that uses exactly the same data. The first row is exactly what you saw on the previous graph. And so we regress the unconditional earnings on the treatment dummy interacted with the post dummy for the first 2.5 years. So this is a short run effect, and then this is a medium term effect for the next 2.5 years. So it's first a reduction by 50 years per half year, and then by 50 euros per half year, and then by 100 euros per half year. So where does this effect come from? It could come from the extensive or the intensive margin. So either the mothers drop out of the labor force, or they reduce their hours conditional on working. And what we find is that there's absolutely no response on the extensive margin. So the probability of employment in the second row doesn't change at all. The entire effect comes through the conditional earnings. So mothers reduce their hours and their earnings in response to the more generous pension wealth. And one indication that this is really an hours effect and not an effect on the hourly wage is that the conditional probability of working full-time also decreases. Now you might ask, how do these mothers achieve this reduction in hours? It's not so easy typically to adjust your hours. I think especially Spain is one of these countries where part-time work is not that prevalent, but this is very different in Germany. So we actually looked at, do these mothers switch the establishment to reduce their hours? Do they switch their occupation? So do they change in a more part-time intensive occupation? And we don't find any evidence for that. So the mothers stay with their current employer and are still able to reduce their hours. And in the German setup, this is quite plausible because there are extensive rights to adjust your hours. And that is one caveat that I think if you think of a similar reform in a different country, you might expect maybe less of an intensive margin effect than you have in the German context. So here are just the graphs again to convince you that all the effects come from the intensive margin and not the extensive margin. So it's the probability of being employed before and after the reform, and you see there is no effect of the reform at all. And here are the total earnings conditional on employment, and that's really where we see the reduction coming from. So it's an intensive margin deduction in earnings of these women. And here's the probability of working full-time, conditional on employment, and here you see that it decreases, and in the regression it's marginally significant. So more women switch from full-time to part-time. I would also expect that there is adjustment within the group of working full-time, within the group of working part-time, but we don't have any finer hours measure than the one that we provide here. So these are the reduced form estimates. So the total unconditional earnings fall by roughly 200 euros per year, and that is a decrease of 1.3% relative to the baseline earnings. And I already told you the pension wealth actually increases by 4.4%. So if you translate that in an elasticity, you get an elasticity of minus 0.3. But more interesting might be the statistic of the marginal propensity to earn. So for each additional euro that you get in terms of wealth, how large is the reduction in earnings? To get at that number, we use this annuitization approach that Golosov and co-authors also use in their study, where they look at lottery winners. So the idea is basically that you assume that the change in pension wealth gets distributed equally over the remaining working lifetime until the retirement age. And then, so you take this, in our case, that would be 17 years. You basically take 1/17 of this as the change in pension wealth in every year. And then you relate this longer-term effects on earnings to this number. And if we do that, we get an implied marginal propensity to earn of minus 0.54. So again, for every euro of pension wealth, earnings get reduced by 54 cents. So is this large or small? How does it compare to the literature? So Gelber et al., they look at responses also looking at retirement changes, but of individuals who are closer to retirement in the context of the US. And they find a marginal propensity to earn of minus 0.6 for men and minus 0.9 for women. So ours is slightly smaller, but it is on the intensive margin, while they find it on the extensive margin. And also, what I find quite remarkable is that our change really comes with regard to future pension wealth, right? So the wealth actually is only paid out, basically the pension is only paid out in 17 years from now. So if there's some myopia, but also some liquidity constraints, that could lead to lower responses. Yeah, and the second thing that is interesting in our study is really that you find this response along the intensive margin, not the extensive margin one. So typically studies find responses on the extensive margin, but they look at older individuals, so 60 years or older, for whom the retirement decision really becomes relevant. So what that could point to is that there's varying costs of adjusting different margins of labor supply over the working life of an individual, which I think would make a lot of sense. So for 50-year-old women, dropping out of the labor force is actually quite costly because you suffer a lot of human capital depreciation, and the change in wealth is not large enough so that you would want to stay out of the labor market until retirement. Yeah. Okay, so these are the main results that we find. So let's look at the heterogeneity of the effects, and we were thinking about there could be heterogeneity along different margins. So the first margin we were thinking about is that it might matter how large your returns to tenure are. So if you are in a job that has a lot of returns to tenure, then cutting back your labor supply is more costly than if you are in a job that has a relatively flat wage profile. So we are already looking at in women who are on average 50 years old, so wage profiles become flatter at that age anyhow, but we still find that individuals with a higher predicted return to tenure respond less strongly at the intensive margin. So let me, oops. Now I have the same problem. Let me show this result. So what we do is we compute occupation-specific returns to tenure using a sample of men and for 127 occupations, and we construct a sample of men such that they have the same age structure as our women. So we do look at tenure in different occupations at the age of roughly 50 for 127 occupations, and then we split our women into two groups, namely those that have below median returns to tenure and those who have above median returns to tenure, and here we interact our variable of interest, so the treatment dummy interacted with the post dummy, with being an occupation with an above median return to tenure, and you see that the coefficients are always positive, and it's also significant here on full-time employment. So the women who are in below median return to tenure, so in low return to tenure occupation, they respond stronger than the women who are in occupations that have a relatively high tenure return profile. We were also thinking that maybe women who work in occupations that have a lot of physical strain, they might respond more strongly, so they might take this opportunity to reduce their working hours, but we actually don't find any difference in that. So we use the same 127 occupations, and we use this ONET description and assign a physical strain to each occupation, but there we don't find any heterogeneity. Then the second dimension of heterogeneity that we were thinking about had to do with the liquidity constraints and the ability to self-insure. So again, this wealth effect is there, but it only materializes in the future. So if an individual is liquidity constrained, a mother, she might want to cut back her labor supply, but she cannot borrow against this future increase in wealth, so she might not able to do that. And in fact, we find stronger, so more negative labor supply responses at the intensive margin when the partner's earnings are high. So we were looking for different measures of liquidity constraints. In the administrative data, you have nothing that is similar to wealth. So as a proxy, we take the partner's earning. And here now we again differentiate these women into two groups. The one who are married to husbands with below median earning, and the other who are married to husbands with above median earning. And you see that the responses are much larger for the women who are married to relatively well-earning husbands, right? So these are women who are less likely to be liquidity constraints, and they respond stronger to the reform. And we find a similar effect if we measure liquidity constraint not by the husband's earnings, but by the own or the household pension points, which you could think could be a measure of wealth if you assume that those households that have accumulated a lot of pension wealth, they had a lot of earnings in the past, so they might have also accumulated more wealth. And the last heterogeneity that we were thinking of is the time to full retirement, and here specifically we were interested in seeing, do the women who are older at the time of the reform, so they are closer to the retirement age, do they respond stronger to the reform, or maybe are they more likely to respond on the extensive margin? So do they use the reform to actually enter retirement earlier? But in fact, we find no differential effects at all by the time to the full retirement age, or by the age of the women at the reform. But here, I think the main caveat that we face is that any woman who is older at the time of the reform, she was also quite old. She was older when she gave birth to her first child, right? So the average woman was 27 when she gave birth to her first child and 49 at the time of the reform. So a woman who was 59 at the time of the reform, she was 38 when she gave birth to her first child, and that just might be a woman who's more attached to the labor market in general, and maybe that's why we see less of a response for this woman, right? So here we cannot really disentangle age at the reform and age at first birth, which are one-to-one correlated. So it's not the ideal setup to really see whether different margins of adjustment become important at different ages, which I think is a very interesting research question if you find a setting where you can address it. And then the last thing we were interested in is the intra-household behavior. So are there spillover effects of spouses? So if the women's pension wealth changes, does that also affect the income of the husband? And in fact, we do find some weak evidence in line for partners' labor market responses. So here I show you the results for husband's earnings, and I just want to point out right away, we only have 38,000 here, so we had 100,000 women. So obviously some women don't have a partner, but it's also that with this statistical matching procedure, we are not capturing all the couples that should be there. So we would have expected rather like 60 to 70,000 observations here. But here you see the earnings responses of the husbands of these women, and you see that overall they are qualitatively similar, but they are not really significant except for this one coefficient here on the conditional probability of working full-time. But if you trust the coefficient, the point estimates, they are roughly half the size of the point estimates for the women. Right? So there is some evidence also that it's not only the women who reduce their labor supply, but also the partners. I want to stress again that statistically this is not very significant, and maybe if we had better data on the actual partners and husbands, we could get more significant results here. So that's it for this paper. So what we do in this paper, we provide evidence of an anticipatory labor supply response to pension wealth changes. And we find what I would say is a relatively large marginal propensity to earn of minus 0.5. So what that means is that it shows that individuals are really forward-looking, not only when they make their consumption savings decisions, but also when they make their labor supply decisions. And secondly, if you trust these estimates of the within household spillovers, then that means that the responses to individual changes in individual incentives to work can be larger because they amplify in the household. So if you are a policymaker, what do you take from this study? So what the findings clearly show is that pension reforms can have aggregate labor supply effects that go well beyond this direct impact that they have on people who enter retirement earlier or later. So now we are looking at a reform that made pensions more generous. So if you trust that these results would be a mirror image, if you make pension less generous, and that would mean also that that could have quite a large positive aggregate labor supply effect, which would be good in the current situation of demographic change, which not only puts pressure on the fiscal sustainability of the retirement pension system, but also puts pressure on the labor market, where now these very large cohorts and strong birth cohorts are leaving the labor market, and much smaller cohorts enter the labor market. So you can also compare this result now with other studies of policy measures using Hendren's method of calculating policy elasticities to assess the welfare implications of different, let's say, social welfare measures. So what is this? So first, you would think now, what is this? What is the cost of the reform? So for each euro of pension wealth that you give to these mothers, obviously you pay €1. But at the same time, given that we have a very high marginal tax rate in Germany of 45%, you are losing actually 31 cents in tax revenues by the reduction of labor supply of the women. Right? So for every euro of pension wealth that the government spends, the cost is not only this euro, but it's an additional 31 cents that comes through reduced tax revenues based on the decreased labor earnings. And if you assume a willingness to pay of this reform of 1, so for 1 euro of pension wealth, a woman would be willing to pay 1 euro, and that's by how much it increases her utility, then this translates into a marginal value of a public fund of 0.7 to 0.8. So the marginal value of public fund, that is Hendren's idea, what it really does, it links the willingness to pay of a policy measure with the cost of this policy measure, right? And here the willingness to pay is 1 euro, the cost is 1 euro 31, so the marginal value of public fund is roughly 7.8. And how does this compare with other policy measures that you can think of? So here we take a graph from Hendren and Sprung-Kaiser's Brookings papers, in which they calculate this marginal value of public funds for very different social security, security programs that were analyzed in the literature, and where they plot them by the age of the beneficiary. So here 0, so here you have children between 0 and 20, and then it goes up to 80. And here's our Mütterrente, so the mother's pension, where on average the mothers are 50 years old, and we get a marginal value of public fund of 0.8. And what you can see in this picture, what I find very striking, is that the marginal value of public funds is often, it hovers around 1 for a lot of these transfers that go to adults. So here are cash transfers, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, and so on. But the marginal value of public funds is much, much larger for any measure that goes to children. So here's actually a jump in the scale from 5 to 8, and the marginal value of public funds for measures that go to children is much higher. It's around 8. So that means for every 1 euro you spend on the child, basically the willingness to pay for that is 8 euro, or the other way around. Any measures spent on children, they pay off many times because they lead to higher tax revenues in the future, exactly the opposite of what we have. So from a social insurance kind of viewpoint, you might doubt that the mother's pension reform is really the most valuable way to spend public funds. Okay. That's it. Many thanks. Muchas gracias. Looking forward to your questions.
Danke. So really nice talk, and I just wanted to ask 2 things. The first one is you looked at heterogeneity, and I was wondering whether you can look at pre-reform health of the woman by looking at the sort of the trajectory of having sick leave. So to have a sort of health status for the mother affected. So that's one thing. It's sort of not minor, but I think it could be interesting to see whether unhealthier women that have lower health status would react more. And the second thing is about parental health. So these women, they have now adult children, but they have old parents. And one reason why you might want to adjust labor supply is to take care of them, and that reform might help you to do that. So I was wondering if in your data you can link parental work-life histories with those women's, so to have an exact same measure of parental health, to see whether, it affects more women that have sick parents or that need care. And maybe an alternative would be to have maybe a spatial variation in care for elderly. So I don't know how much variation there is in Germany, but maybe in some districts there are more spaces for old age care homes and others less. So that would be interesting to see, because so in your picture you could add one more point for policies targeted at old age care, and I think in Germany that's a problem like elsewhere. And we know that women in this age, they do reduce labor supply because they have care responsibilities now for their parents.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. These are very interesting suggestions. So unfortunately, with the data limitations, I don't think we can do much. So we don't have any real measure of health status except the one that we haven't thought of. So that's a good idea. Thank you, to really look at the accumulated sick leave. So this is the only thing I think we could ever measure, and we don't know what kind of sick leave this is, but this is something we could look at, and that would be an interesting idea. So we cannot link parents and children in the data set, so already the linking of husbands is done really by matching names and addresses, and that doesn't work anymore when you go across generations. So unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done there. So the only thing I could think of is what you had in mind, that if you had spatial variation in the availability of formal elderly care, I doubt, I mean, first I wouldn't know that there is data on a fine level. I also doubt that there is much of variation. There might be variation between East and West Germany, and that I think I didn't mention. So we only can analyze West Germans because East Germans only enter in the data reliably exactly in 1992. So we miss a control group as a treatment group for the East Germans. So we also cannot look at this East-West comparison, which I would have thought would have been interesting anyhow, because East German women are still much more attached to the labor market than West German women. It would have been very interesting to see, do they respond differently, but unfortunately we can't do that either.
I have. Thanks a lot for the talk. Another dimension of heterogeneity that perhaps you might explore in terms of attachment to the labor market is to see whether responses are different depending on the post-childbirth behavior of these mothers. That is, some measure in some sense of a child penalty that was linked to these first births, which may vary, and responses might be different.
So yeah, this is something that I didn't mention here, but the maternity leave was actually, it was also changed for birth after 1992. So the women in the control group, they have longer maternity leave than the women in the treatment group. To start with, it doesn't matter for our analysis because nothing changes here in 2014, so we are fine there. But it makes it very hard to look at these first years to compare their behavior because they have different policy regimes. So, I mean, one would have to look at age of 5, 6 or so of the child, and that makes it harder. And then we face this problem, I think, that that we could address, that more women stay out of the labor market, but that would be an outcome that we would be interested in. But I think the maternity leave is the main difficulty there. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. I think what was quite convincing is that it's not the extensive margin, but I'm not sure what you call the intensive margin, if that actually is the intensive margin. It could equally be bonus payments. I mean, take bonus payments. Take a nurse, for example. She could say, I'm more resistant to take night shifts. She has the same amount of hours, but she doesn't work at night, she doesn't get the bonuses, and that would show up in terms of earnings in your data set. So what you could do is you could look at, given that you know whether workers do full-time, part-time, mini-jobs, you could see if they are transitioning these statuses. And there could be an interesting interaction with the Social Security, because given that they get these extra pension points, they may shift to mini-jobs or something like that.
Yeah. So, and that's a very important point. So we interpret it as an hours response, and you're saying it could be an hourly wage response. So an hourly wage per se I didn't find very convincing. The bonus payment could be something. If you are in a job where you say, I go the extra mile and I get a bonus, and then you might not be willing to go this extra mile anymore, that could have an effect. I mean, we do find this, it's here, I think. So we do find that the probability of working full-time conditional on working decreases. So there is some shift from full-time to part-time. You also see a little bit from part-time to marginal employment. So I do think, I mean, so for sure, I would say there is some hours margin that could still leave some margin for what you have in mind, but I would guess that it is rather small. But the bonus is, I mean, would be, I think, more plausible than the hourly wages per se. I don't think bonus payments are not in the data per se, so you cannot investigate them separately, yeah, unfortunately. We finished right on time, so thanks a lot.